At season's end, where is Luther Burden III going to rank in Missouri history? Can he be the Tigers' greatest receiver of all time? Let's talk about that and more right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, all you true sons and daughters, I'm John Miller, your Mizzou mafioso. And is it great to be alive on a Tuesday in Columbia, Missouri, or what? Coming up on today's program, I want to talk about all kinds of Missouri football topics, including, yes, some hot kicker talk. And is it time we just end the SEC championship game already? But before I start the show, I want to remind you today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as playoffs wind down. The sports stop sporting like we want them to. But this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right, there is something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. And I want to get started today actually playing off of a post at Power Mizzou that got a lot of traction. Old Hood Tiger, a popular frequent poster over there at Power Mizzou, basically put out there, hey, Luther Burden or Jeremy Maclin, who would you take in this barbershop debate, essentially? And that just really got me thinking, you know what, where is Luther Burden going to rank at season's end in terms of all-time receivers? Does he actually have a chance to be considered better than Jeremy Maclin or the great Denario Alexander, as others have thrown out there? They think he's the best receiver in Missouri history, or perhaps even Justin Gage, one of my all-time favorites as well. But I think at this point, if you're just going to say compare Luther Burden to Jeremy Maclin, as was the original premise there, well, I think it's pretty obvious at this point that Luther Burden has played 2 seasons. Jeremy Maclin played 2 seasons. Well, J-Mac's 2 years at this point are better. And there's really not much of an argument to that, especially when you look at the fact that 07, 08, well, those were just better seasons overall so far than 22 and 23 for the Tigers. Now, I'd put 23 up there with about any season in Missouri history, but really, what's astonishing to me in retrospect, when you go back and look at Jeremy Maclin's numbers, is just how many touches the Tigers gave him in his redshirt sophomore and redshirt freshman seasons with the Tigers, especially coming off of a significant knee injury that caused him to have that redshirt season in 2006. And it's not just in the passing game, by the way, where, of course, well, those 07-08 Tigers ran a hurry-up offense and passed with more frequency than the 23 Tigers. But not only so, 51 more receptions in those 2 seasons for Maclin. That's a big amount. That's a really significant amount. But also in rushing attempts, Jeremy Maclin had 91 rushing attempts in 2 years versus just 25 for Luther Burden. Also a combined 133 kick returns and punt returns compared to just 20 total punt returns for Luther Burden in 2 years. I mean, my goodness, I've talked a decent bit in this offseason occasionally about, hey, we can find some clever ways to maybe lighten Luther Burden's load a little bit. But then you look at Jeremy Maclin and the load he carried for those 2 seasons, the amount of touches there's really no comparison whatsoever. And again, this isn't a criticism really of Burden's usage of the Missouri offense or anything like that. It's more of just a tip of the cap and an acknowledgement of what an incredible player Jeremy Maclin was for his 2 seasons at Missouri. But here's the thing. Ultimately, I think Burden actually does have a chance to pass, well, everybody on the receiver side in Missouri history. If indeed, for example, my bold prediction that Luther Burden's going to be in New York for the Heisman ceremony as one of the finalists this coming December, if that indeed ends up happening, yeah, I think Burden could be, and maybe will be, very well could be considered and should be deservedly considered one of, if not the best receiver in Missouri history. But I do think it's going to take that type of a season, not only for him individually, but also the team as well. Probably a college football playoff appearance. And again, this is not taking nothing away from Burden. This is just reminding everybody of just what a tremendous player Jeremy Maclin was, not only on a per touch basis, but just in terms of the amount of volume that Gary Pinkel and Dave Christensen and Dave Yost just kept giving this guy over and over and over again. And he'd take a big shot, shake off the cobwebs on the sidelines, and just keep coming back in there. So Maclin, I think over the years we've forgotten that not only was he just an incredibly explosive player, one of the toughest players, I'd say, in Missouri history as well. And speaking of the message boards and social media and lots of places online, well, I'm still seeing the argument that Missouri in 2024, maybe the best case scenario is the Tigers go 11-1, finish third place in the SEC, and, well, then the Tigers could avoid the SEC championship game, get all healed up and prepared for what would promise to be, in that scenario, certainly a pretty strong seed. Certainly not a top 4, but probably in that 5 to 8 range where you'd get a home playoff game in that scenario. So a lot of reasons for that. Also, if you are a 5 seed, more than likely you're going to play the 12 seed. Well, you'll definitely play the 12 seed. The 12 seed will likely be the group of 5 champion, or the highest ranked team out of the group of 5, somebody like Memphis or Boise State, perhaps somebody like that. So that is going to be an advantage there for whoever gets that 5 seed versus the 6, 7, 8, that type of deal. So from that perspective, if you just look at it in terms of what's good for Missouri winning the college football playoff or advancing as far as they can, then they're probably right. That is maybe the best case scenario. But of course, my argument has been, man, I just want to try to win a championship. It's been since 1969 that Missouri's won a conference title. Wouldn't that mean a heck of a lot? Wouldn't that mean just as much as maybe winning one playoff game, for example? But regardless of rehashing that argument again, to me, the people who say that's not really an argument for... To me, that's an argument for saying, okay, if that's really how you feel, and that's how college football teams are going to play this, including Missouri, maybe that's how they'll really feel if you give them the old lie detector test. Well, to me, that's an argument for simply getting rid of the SEC championship game. It doesn't mean that the SEC title means less, because if you're the SEC, that cannot be the takeaway. It can't just be that, well, that SEC title, this thing that's meant everything for about, 80 years, 100 years, whatever it's been, we're just going to throw that away and all that history. To me, that is not an option. How can you let that happen to your brand, which is it just means more? Well, if that's the case, then prove it. I guess it should just be a regular season championship. Again, if everybody's right, and this is how college football is going to look at conference championships now, then I guess we should just have a regular season winner. But no, of course, the people in charge, the powers that be, are going to want to have that SEC title game out there that gets a 25-30 crazy rating, that does big numbers on television. So I totally get that, but to me, you can't have it both ways. At a certain point, you have to give up something in order to gain something. And in this case, maybe giving up that game in Atlanta, the SEC title game, is worth the gain of a 12-team playoff. Honestly, though, just having 16 teams, this bloated conference of what it is, especially a conference that still hasn't decided tiebreakers, maybe that's not the best way when you can't. There's obviously not even half. You're basically playing half of a round-robin schedule. That's the problem with having this big, bulky conference is, unfortunately, at a certain point, the championship itself stops meaning as much as it used to. The SEC says it just means more, or we're kind of in the process right now of lessening the importance of its own championship. That's a big fumble, in my humble opinion. And I got a lot of commentary from the listenership on My comments about how Missouri should throw for dough this season, especially on early downs. Let's open up the passing game just a little bit more. Well, some of the reaction disagreed with me, and I'm just going to respond to that here in a little bit. And as a little preview, I'm just going to tell you guys something right now. This whole thing of establishing the run, yeah, that's actually a total myth as far as I can tell. So let's talk about that here in just a little bit. First, though, let's talk some FanDuel because I love sports and I love them so much. I never want them to stop. But this time of year, sports aren't quite the calendar, just not quite as packed as I would like it to be. But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open up the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And you know what? I got to say, there's an early season game, week 1, the Georgia Bulldogs minus 13.5 against Clemson. You know what? I think I like the dogs there in Athens. I have to say, same quarterback, Carson Beck. How do you bet against Georgia at this point? I mean, honestly, almost think Clemson's name is giving it too much credit, though. So anything under 2 touchdowns, give me the dogs. But regardless, head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. It is FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Thanks for making Locked On Mizzou your first listen every day. For your second listen, check out Locked On Sports Today, bringing you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And once again, I think the Tigers need to throw the ball more frequently on first down than it did last season. Now, part of that is some questions about the Missouri defense. Perhaps it takes a bit of a step back this season after multiple guys being drafted into the NFL this season, but not everybody agrees with me. In fact, Sean said, on the contrary, Sean commenting here on YouTube said, on the contrary, I think we can get both Noel and Carroll going. Then the passing yards will come. We had one rusher in Schrader that could do damage on the ground for the most part. If we can have 2 guys that take that load, then the passing game should take another huge step forward, because at that point, do you bring more in the box, or do you still try doubling Burden, Weiss, etc.? So to that point, obviously a strong running game is no doubt going to help the Missouri passing game. I agree with that. And also another comment here by Reese. He says, I think Jones, being Brandon Jones, the offensive line coach, and also running backs coach Curtis Looper are both really good coaches and will be able to get the running game going again. You know what? I totally agree with that premise. I really do. This wasn't me trying to throw cold water on any optimism about Missouri's running game or anything like that. My main point was really just that I think Missouri's passing game this season truly has a chance to be special. And again, we might need to score a little bit more this season, and we'll see. Again, one more comment here by somebody I'll just call a bunch of letters and a bunch of numbers. Says, I could actually see this running game potentially being better this season. Carroll and Noel could be a great duo. They both have produced at a lower level of competition, much like Cody Schrader. They also should complement each other very well. Again, I agree with all of that. There's nothing wrong with that premise, and I hope you're totally correct, by the way, and it does seem like at first glance Carroll and Noel complement each other well. But I'll just say this. There's just a simple statistical thing here. It's called yards per rush and yards per pass, right? I'm not even talking about yards per catch here. I'm just talking about anytime you throw the ball, how many yards do you get? Anytime you turn around and hand the ball off or run a jet sweep or the quarterback scrambles for a rush of some sort, what are you getting? What is your yards per attempt there? Well, quite frankly, the numbers are not even close, to the point where you can make an argument that Missouri should throw on every single down if you're simply just looking at a spreadsheet. For example, passing yards per attempt last season. For the team, it was 9. On a rush, it was less than 5. So you've nearly doubled your production in the passing game simply on a per attempt basis. And again, by the way, Cody Schrader was the most effective Missouri rusher last season, averaging nearly 6 yards per attempt. But you look at Luther Burden, and when he caught the ball, heck, not even when he caught the ball, when he was throwing the ball, even if the ball was incomplete. So I'm including passes that went for 0 yards here. Burden, 10 yards per target. Again, Cody Schrader, 6 yards per rush, just as a comparison. Even Mookie Cooper and Brett Norfleet were above 9 per target. Theo Weiss was above 8. And by the way, Tyler Stevens, who dropped a bunch of passes last year, was not the most popular player among the fans. Well, Missouri tight end Tyler Stevens averaged 4.9 yards per target last year. That's slightly above Missouri's average per rushing attempt by the team last year. So what does that tell you? Again, some of you might jump to the conclusion, oh, I guess Missouri should just throw it 65 times a game. I'm not saying that at all because, well, there is something called the law of diminishing returns, which absolutely is undefeated for a whole bunch of different reasons. Number one, you're exposing your quarterback to tremendous punishment in that case. More often than not, quarterbacks get hurt in the pocket, not scrambling. Maybe that's a little counterintuitive to some people, but indeed it is very much true. But mostly, though, I think the biggest point here is that this whole idea of, well, you got to establish the run. That's mostly what I'm pushing back against. And again, I understand you need to actually statistically, by the way, 3rd and 1, 4th and 1. No, running the ball is more effective. So there is that part of football as well. It's not just how many yards do you get on each individual play, of course. There's the whole, the chains, the first down marker, pretty big part of the game. So I acknowledge all of that. My main point here is I just thought that last season, at least compared to this season, I think Missouri should be a little more aggressive on early downs, on 1st and 10s, because, well, then they'll get themselves into those 2nd and 1, 2nd and 2s more frequently, where you can run the football, wear out the defensive line, and move those chains, hopefully. My point here is that this whole thing of, establishing the run early helps you run more effectively. I'm sorry, from all the evidence I've ever seen in my life, from watching football, and by the way, very deep statistical dives that have been taken by writers who have done much more research on this topic than I have, it turns out you can either run the football on your opponent or you can't. Or you can run it average effectiveness or a below average, above average, and everything in between. But it turns out that running frequently early versus passing doesn't change that fact whatsoever. So again, if your offensive line is simply outmatched against the other team's defensive line, how is simply running a bunch of times early in the game for no gain going to change that fact in the 3rd and 4th quarter? The simple fact is that it doesn't. Now, there may be individual moments in games where you could say, okay, the frequency of running here actually is wearing down the opponent. But again, that's because you're running the ball effectively. No defensive line has ever been gotten worn down by a team that's averaging 2.5 yards a carry and not moving the chains. That simply doesn't work. So this whole thing of establishing the run, I hear about old wives' tales like, oh, well, if you have a wet head when you go outside, then you're going to catch cold. The dumbest thing I've ever heard that has no scientific basis, but it's an old wives' tale. Well, guess what? Establishing the run, that's an old husband's tale. It's been said over and over again, so it's been just taken up as a fact. Well, I'm going to challenge you all out there. Show me some evidence that that's the case, because I don't think you can. Now, while a lot of Missouri fans are understandably worried about the absence of Harrison Mevis as the Tigers' place kicker this season, for me personally, that's not even in my top 5 list of concerns. Maybe not even top 10. Certainly not top 5. And if you think that I'm just brushing it aside, well, I'm going to explain where exactly I'm coming from after these quick words. And thanks again for making Locked On Mizzou your first listen every day, and especially, of course, to you everydayers. like Raymond out there who says, I listen to all your podcasts and I know quarterback and receiver is your first love. Can you talk about kickers at least once? More important than you seem to want to cover, important last year to 2 games directly or 2 or 3 more quite important. Sorry, that ending there didn't quite make sense. But I see what Raymond was getting at here, and he thinks I'm just brushing past Harrison Mevis. Well, here's the deal, Raymond. It's not that obviously kicker cannot be an important position. It is an important position. Without that, of course, 60-plus yard field goal by Mevis to win the game for Missouri last year, perhaps they don't win. And I do say perhaps because there would have been certainly an overtime period in that Wildcats-Tigers ball game in week 3. So we'll see what happens there. I'd also point out that in 2022, Harrison Mevis missed a very easy chip shot field goal against Auburn that would have won the game as well in somewhat similar scenarios, although obviously a much more difficult kick that was made, ironically enough, in that case. But the reason I am not focusing on the kicker position as much is, number one, just in terms of sharing interesting opinions about kickers. Well, obviously I hope that Blake Craig, or who's presumably going to be Missouri's place kicker this season, or whoever it ends up being, I hope they make all their kicks, right? I think we all Missouri fans can agree with that. I'm just not really sure what else I'm supposed to say about the place kicker other than I hope he kicks them long and accurate. Other than that, I just don't have much more to add. The only thing I would really add is, let's just say over the last, since Gary Pinkel was named Missouri's coach in 2001, I'm just having a lot of difficulty thinking of a Missouri season that was ever really derailed by a missed kick. Certainly in 2022, the Tigers would have won another game against Auburn if Mevis would have made that field goal. And there's no doubt that, would have been nice to beat South Carolina in 2023 when Andrew Baggett missed that field goal. But at the same time, Missouri didn't really need that South Carolina game ultimately. The Tigers ended up in the SEC title game, the de facto Final Four of college football at that point that season. So again, I just think that although there are these famous moments in college football, think wide right, for example, Miami against Florida State years ago. Sure, there are famous moments of missed kicks and made kicks, just like Mevis against K-State last year. But I just think too often those moments are really few and far between. More often than not, Missouri games, we'll just stick to Missouri here, Missouri games are not decided by a single field goal. In all likelihood, there could be one game that's decided by a single field goal. But again, even that's sometimes an oversimplification, especially when like the game winner against Florida last season was from 30 some odd yards, 35 yards, something like that. That's a kick that's going to go in 85, 90% of the time, no matter who's kicking it in college football. So let's just not overrate that position. I'm not saying it's an unimportant position or an irrelevant position. That would be silly. I just think that, again, like with establishing the run in particular, I think that Missouri fans and just football fans in general sometimes tend to overrate the kicker spot. But I will say, speaking of kickers, there was a commitment. Hey, there's something to talk about here with place kickers, by the way. Robert Meyer from Colfax High School in Southern California, the latest addition to Missouri's recruiting class. And by the way, the other day when I was talking about the Missouri coaching staff, I did leave one guy off, and I didn't mean that to be an insult to Eric Link, the Missouri tight ends and special teams coach. But I will say, I think he's done a solid job at Missouri. I don't have any hot takes really on Eric Link one way or the other. I will say, though, that compared to the rest of the staff, compared to Brandon Jones, for example, or Al Davis, for instance, I would probably be the least concerned of really anybody on the staff if Eric Link were to leave Missouri. So, again, Eric Link, let's just think about kickers for a minute. Obviously, Harrison Mevis was great at Missouri. I'll give him credit there. Now, the post-Corey Fatone Missouri punting game has really left something to be desired. I'd say it's been a mixed bag at best, to be honest with you. So, to me, I think it's all kind of an open question at this point on just how great of a job Eric Link is doing. Hey, Brett Norfleet, again, he's the tight ends coach as well. If he has a big breakout season, he deserves credit there for sure. But there hasn't been like a serious stud tight end yet during his time either. Again, don't mean this to be hugely insulting to Eric Link. That's not the point here. But again, realistically, he's probably the guy, if he left, I'd probably be the least bummed out about it, to put it one way. But anyway, thanks as always for joining me here on Locked On Mizzou. I appreciate you all listening as always. And you know what? Let's get some opposition research in here. It's election time, so it feels appropriate to get some oppo research going. Let's maybe talk to the Locked On Sooners guy, the Locked On Bama guys, see what's going on and these really important opponents for Missouri coming up in the show here soon enough. So until next time, I am John Miller. Thanks as always for listening to Locked On Mizzou.